Abe here, and I wanted to let you know that if you're able, you can upgrade your small beans skill over at patreon.com/smallbeans. Here's why you should do that. If you pledge 5 measly beans a month, you get access to about half our podcasts that you don't get if you're just listening to the free feed. Shows include Star Trek The Next Futurama, Spiel Boys, Like Razor Blade Pie, and bonus episodes of I'll Show You Mine If You Show Me Yours. Not to mention bonus content including info and updates on the movie we're making, Papa Bear. Hey, where's all the reasons to not subscribe to Patreon? I can't find them. Anyway, back to the show.
Abe, I was deeply disappointed to learn this isn't a Michael Bay film. I really thought this one was Michael Bay. It really did.
It's a part of my theory, in fact.
We were talking about it last week, and I was like, wait, that's a fucking Michael Bay film. And you were like, nah, bro.
Nah, dude.
And I couldn't believe that
Con
shit.
Air has nothing to do with Michael Bay, other than, I guess, Jerry Bruckheimer produced.
Yeah, he does seem like part of the original ingredient to the Michael Bay formula, right?
Oh, he's the Rock, baby.
Yeah, you love that Joker bit so much. It's your favorite.
I love saying baby.
You do.
Like a fool.
You do.
I love being a fool.
Sure. That's why we're doing this job instead of like being lawyers or whatever.
Oh, God.
Can I mention to you? Yeah, man. Get depressed about what could have been.
Oh, God.
Can I mention to you how disappointed I was when I watched this, that I never thought of being Cameron Poe on Escape from the Multiverse? Like,
I mean, he's
I wanted to do that
all-time
so bad.
banger, dude. Cameron Poe is Nicolas Cage's character in Con Air.
My God.
And what is he doing?
What is his deal? Like, oh my God. We would have had so much fun. A good hour of that.
So good, man.
Excellent. Yes, truly
He's just
excellent.
memorable as fuck. I love it so much.
Like, the performance is a hairstyle. We agree with that, right? Like, that is the performance.
Basically.
It's a hairstyle.
It's a wind glistening through his sweaty hair.
A slicked back, his slicked back, untied hair.
As he soaks in the freedom. You know, I don't know why we don't just cut to the chase and just call this film America.
I don't know either.
It's got it all. Ex-Ranger, newborn babies to fight for, incompetent cops discussing jurisdiction. No, you're out of line. And just going at high speeds and Nicolas Cage narrating.
That's all anyone wants.
Talking about his little child that he's never met. Fucking love it.
He got 10 years for the crime that begins this film, by the way, which seems insane.
Nothing makes sense
utterly
once you start
insane.
picking it apart. Like, what is he doing on this, like, high...
Why is he on this plane at all?
Like, he's just a manslaughter charge.
Right.
Like, why... Like, there's other planes.
Put
Like,
him
what
in a
the
car and take him there. What are we doing?
You don't need to put him with the Hannibal Lecter.
Why do we need...
Why
do we need... He's getting discharged. He's on his way to being discharged. Why is he on any plane? Just put him outside. That's it.
Just put him outside. Let him figure it out. Yeah, that's how it works as far as I understand.
Give him his cigarette lighter. They're all obligated to have an old cigarette lighter. Just give it to him and let him walk around.
I just kick rocks, Nick Cage.
Kick rocks, bro. They didn't do that though, and thank God they didn't
do that. They needed to put him on the plane.
Yeah,
you know.
Sure.
So I was watching this movie as one does alone
for funsies, right?
Let's be honest. A Tuesday night.
Yeah,
you know. And I had the thought, hey. You know, be a good episode of Directorpiece Theater, which is what the show is.
Right.
I'm Abe Epperson. That's Adam Ganzer.
Mm.
This is where we talk about directors and the tactics they employ to make movies that we love or didn't expect to be like good or whatnot. You know, like, oh, wow, there's craft here. And I was like, man, we should look at the construction of 1997's Con Air. And as you alluded to, that's a sentence that made it clear to me why my mom preferred that I do become a lawyer or something. Because like that's where my brain goes. Legitimately, that gives me joy. The construction of Con Air gives me joy.
Yeah.
And I have to think about the existential merit of that.
Yes. And it makes your mother grieve. You're just grieving your mother.
And it makes a lot of sadness in my family around what I could have been.
Christmas
because I could have been a ranger. I could have been Nicolas Cage in this movie, and she would probably be like, "Now that's my son.
Now that's a son. That's an Abe that we can all be proud of. Stand behind."
I love you, Mom.
Yeah.
You don't listen to any of my podcasts because you don't care. Because I understand.
Because you're not a ranger.
Why would you do that? But much love to you.
If you were a ranger, do you think she'd listen to your podcast?
I don't think so. If I talked about ranger shit, I don't think she's just got a podcast in her.
Okay, fair enough. I like to think that she would. If you were a ranger, she'd tune into your podcast. That makes me happy.
Yep.
To think
I gotta get it. I gotta get to my theory.
Sorry.
One love, Mom. One love.
One love.
All right. So Nicolas Cage is a ranger, as we mentioned.
Yeah.
And we start this film with a salute to rangers. He comes home from the war. I don't know.
Right.
And he's got a pregnant wife. Yeah. I assume he's like Black Ops. They mention at one point he's Black Ops.
He went to Iraq? Is that what we assume?
Don't pin me down, baby.
Okay, all right. Fair enough.
Point is, he's got a pregnant wife.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Baby, I love you." And she's like, "I love you, baby." And a drunk, they're at a bar and a drunk shits on the military, which is always what a Bruckheimer thing. It's just instant.
Yeah, you
instant
piece
asshole
of shit.
character.
Yeah.
And he's just, "I just want to make love, baby. I don't want to fight." And outside, after that night, the group of local drunks that were making fun of him for being in the military and like a lethal weapon,
and for
like
having a wife,
and having a wife and just dancing, they beat on him, and they pull a knife, and so he's like, I gotta get serious, and he punches the main drunk so good at him that he dies.
I know. They slowed it down and everything.
And this is something that is like one of those cultural urban myths. I'm sure someone will be like, well, actually, which, cool. Like this has happened probably. Manslaughter charges just on like, I'm not talking about like I push someone and they like fall on a rock and hit their head and they're dead.
But if you punch him in the throat or something.
I punch him in the throat and that guy's just an instant kill.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to be like, wow, he's a really good ranger. But obviously it's the double-edged sword of I'm too strong.
See, I would argue that was actually kind of confusing because I thought for a second, did he grab that guy's knife and stab him in the jaw?
Yeah. Yeah, I think they didn't show the knife as much. Because they needed the knife to show threat of violence, like real violence.
Correct.
But yeah, they didn't want Nicolas Cage to have the knife because he's got to be the underdog.
Yeah. Well,
we're like 4 minutes into the movie.
It's like it felt like 4 seconds into the movie. Like you're just trying to get your bearings, and he's getting trashed outside in the pouring rain. Yeah. And you're like,
he basically
what?
gets a manslaughter charge as the setup because the judge is like, "You too fucking rad. We have to put you in prison."
Mr. Cage, you've pled guilty, which was supposed to get you 2 years, but you're so awesome at killing. I gotta punish you more.
You are. Yeah, you're that urban myth that like, these guns aren't legal kind of idea that that joke that everyone makes or whatever the fuck the joke they all make about their guns.
Your hands are registered lethal weapons.
That's it. And fuck it. Like that's a good start. That's enough. We know what we need to know about him. Let's get on a fucking plane.
Sure.
This is in any case
this is before Mad Max Fury Road, but you could sense the man on the guitar cart he's
standing on deck.
He's chugging right now already. Yes.
Yeah, dude. And chug. He, in any case, like, it's alarming how many times when you really look at the pieces, this is just Die Hard. At one point, he even draws on a Dave Chappelle's shirt, dead Dave Chappelle's shirt, and throws him off the plane to send a note to John Cusack. Killer cast, by the way.
Oh my god, incredible cast.
Like, who we got?
Ving
Nick Cage,
Rhames?
John Cusack, John Malkovich,
Cole
Steve Buscemi,
Meany?
Cole Meany. Fuck me, dude. Just a bunch of dudes. Danny Trejo.
Yeah, Trejo. Just one of the dudes.
Just one of the dudes, and they're all monsters, which is great.
Yeah. You said Buscemi, right?
Must have been fun. Yeah, Buscemi is in there as the the worst of them all, the Hannibal Lecter character, I guess. So yeah, he's gonna die hard on this plane. But this movie actually has something that I think is slightly anthemic to this era of the action films. I'm specifically focusing on like kind of the mid to late 90s and even into the early 2000s, where it's kind of like what we would call like the Michael Bay takeover.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
The bakeover.
And it's not like a takeover where he's like, this is how it's made now. It's just people mimicking people and seeing something they're like, that's a really effective way to do that. I'm going to do that in my film. That's all anything ever is anyway. So yeah, they're doing some stuff in this movie that is like directly out of the book of other action movies of this era. And so I noticed this first when we were looking around the plane setup and how it's like it's straight up just cells and shielding around the hull.
Yeah.
Makes it all feel sterile. Basically, it's just prison like, right? They made a prison on a plane, which is not how I assume they do this kind of thing in real life. I don't know. But it doesn't matter.
But we must remember that the movie The Fugitive was a huge hit.
Yeah.
And like
true.
That scene in The Fugitive is basically this movie. Right? Like,
but that's like a normal bus with a grate at the front.
That's I'm going to use this word very gently, grounded movie.
That's a grounded movie.
Yeah.
This is like, we have like crazy like lockdown mechanisms and multiple areas that are just, prisons, I guess.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I wanted to kind of pick apart what that is doing and how that's like other films too.
I'm excited.
And there's also other stuff that we could talk at length about, but I'll just mention, it's not just the normal fanfare like the explosive finale and how they do that, or like, the character roles and some of the light racism and weird, like in this movie, a little bit of transphobia of multiple characters. It's the 90's, baby.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're probably guessing at this point, yep, it's another visual strategy episode. And this time it's Simon West, the director of Con Air. So let's unpack how this kind of works. So I mentioned the plane. I want to talk about geography. You know me. I love my geography.
I do.
I love it when it's clear. And you know what makes a clear geography?
Wide shots.
Wide shots.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what Con Air doesn't have in its Act 1 really? Wide shots.
Yeah.
Something I noticed right after the assemble the crew section. Where they're like, this one's called Cyrus the Virus. He's a real piece of shit. There's no wide shots. It's all close-ups of faces and close-ups of, John Cusack kind of announcing it. And we see a little bit outside, like the plane, people in line and stuff, but a lot less wide than you expect it to be. You don't see the full plane. You don't even see, you see barely a part of the plane. So we have that section, which is not really doing a lot of favors because it's doing character introduction. It's not doing geography. Also, it's not a space that they're going to exist. It's a liminal space before they get into the plane itself. But once they arrive at the plane, we get this short section where the inmates meet as they're placed in their kind of respective spots. So we start to see the relative geography that's going to carry us through at least, not like halfway through the movie, but like 30% of the movie. Where everyone's kind of seated where they're supposed to be and locked down.
I don't think we ever know where people are seated. I feel like I don't feel like we ever know that.
We don't, because they don't really show wides of the plane, and I found that to be interesting.
Yeah.
Because we do see some relative geography of inmates and the guards that you can imply from eye lines. Like they're distant, they're over there, but like, again, no wide that shows everyone in there. It's just bits and pieces of the guards placing like these high-profile murderers in essentially cages that are closed off. And it's all done fairly close from a camera perspective. And that's because we're worrying about the faces. We're setting the stage in terms of these are our characters. We're not really caring about the geography being clear. And I think that's interesting. I love clear geography in movies. It makes my brain feel good. I think that it's an underrated strategy to adhere to the rules that allow people to be like, I know where everything is, especially because you can fuck with that and surprise people. But that's neither here nor there. I just think it's smart. Now, this movie's erring on the side of the characters and their faces, kind of locking in the minds of the audience members, like who's who and where they're sitting. But since it's going to all get mixed up soon anyway, like, I actually think it's a smart choice by the movie. We don't need to show it, and we need to favor something else, because we're just, much like Aliens or much like a lot of films like Avatar or whatnot, like films that like have like, all right, here's the crew that you're going to be with the whole time, Armageddon. These movies, you want to get as much face time with, you know, the Ving Rhames, with the, you know, John Malkoviches as possible.
With the Cyrae.
Because it's not just like one protagonist that we have to follow. It's like you want to follow the group.
Well,
and you don't want to single them out.
This movie has a huge problem that it has to overcome, which is it has so much exposition up top.
Yeah.
Like it has 25, 30 minutes of setup to do that, like, you know, and it still needs to be fun and an action movie right up top so that it can pull a fugitive. And like, it's interesting you're pointing out that they don't do wides, because like the only films that I can compare to it in terms of exposition is probably a Nolan film. Like, Nolan has this same problem a lot.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. I think that they're not derivative, but like there is a passage of
he's an iteration on this, because
he learned from this.
He's decided, I'm going to shoot it in mostly wides, and just like, fuck you, you don't care about this character. You don't need to care about him. They're just in the scene.
Yeah, he's on screen and he's off screen and talking, and you don't need to care.
Yeah, you don't need to know the
words he's saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially
on something like Tenet, which I think people actually were like, that's going too far.
Right. Right. If Nolan,
because you can,
if Nolan was making Con Air, you would never care about. You would never care about Dave Chappelle's character, or like
not really
the Native American guy he burns alive, or you just wouldn't, you know?
Right. But you do in like these types of
works.
films in this era.
It works in this movie.
Because you mentioned like the fat Act 1, a lot of exposition. Same thing happens in The Rock.
Yeah.
You know, like Michael Bay is victim of this as well.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if it's a victim. It's a choice. He's like, this is how I want to get the pace going. Exposition is an easy way to like evoke pace, because you can just have wall-to-wall explanation of shit over shots, montage over, you know, whatever you want to show. So that's one of the reasons I think they do this, but I'll get to that more later about the pacing. Now the other thing about, so if wide shots aren't there, what is there?
Yeah.
And I kind of alluded to it. You get tons of singles coverage in telephoto. You really notice it when they're like on the airfield coming up to the plane in the early stages of the movie. But even in the small space of the plane, and this is an important distinction about like outside versus inside, it's harder to do what I'm saying, about to say, the telephoto kind of close-ups. It's harder to do in a smaller space.
Absolutely.
And control it, because your lens is so long that it's like sometimes you're like, well, my background is oppressive now, or it doesn't have as much detail as I'd want, so it's just like a gray blob and it doesn't look good. So but this is how these films were shot, like ever since like Bad Boys, ever since all these types of movies started coming out. The telephoto single is like almost a decree.
Yeah.
That's just how we show action movies in this era. It's not how we'd show Die Hard. Like, Die Hard has zero of this.
No, he's
but
on mediums.
It has been the Michael Bay era, and and it continues to be. Watch all the Transformers, watch all the Michael Bay like later films, and you see that shit. And Simon West is essentially doing that, which I'll go into why he's doing that a little bit later as well.
Do you think that, so like, it's weird because, and I don't want to get too far into your theory and disrupt what you're up to, but like, you kind of have to be able to move set pieces around to shoot things this way.
Kind of.
Right?
And they probably had a method for that, because it's clearly a set and they could probably pull walls out.
They have to. There's no way to. So like, as you're implying, being on a telephoto lens means I got to be really far away from what I'm shooting. Right? And that means, and so like if you're trying to find the most economical way to shoot a plane set, unless you can move those walls out, telephoto is the opposite of what you would do. Right? Like wide angle is what you do. I did a scene on a plane set, and I learned a lot about how not to shoot it.
How not to shoot it, right? Yeah.
And that's
There's
interesting.
a lot of not flattering angles in it. Now, the reason that they're doing this is to make the composition controlled and simplistic. I always argue that when we got to the auteur filmmaking era, at least after the 80s, and the arrival, even the 70s, the arrival of people like Ridley Scott and Tony Scott, where they were coming from commercial work. Commercial work was almost in the same way that these movies do, preaching the telephoto lens as gospel. And it's because you can make the background composition easily. Like a wide angle lens, if there's something in the back of frame you don't like, it's sometimes you have to move a mountain to make that work if you still want that composition. Whereas on a telephoto lens, you just pivot over 2 inches, and because of the crazy angle of incidence that's happening with this lens, you can make it work. It's controlled, it's simplistic, you can decide what your background is, if you want it to be a motley series of colors, if you want it to be blurred to all, hell, you can make it look beautiful. And it is a beautiful lens. You get blurring of the background and the foreground. That's one of the effects of a telephoto lens. So the shots look crisp. And it's a favor of, like I was saying, like Michael Mann, Michael Bay, Ridley, Tony Scott. Basically a lot of directors that were crushing action movies in this era, and setting the stage for this is how action movies look. And you get mimicry all over the place, including, I would argue, in 97, one of the early adopters of this. And I would actually argue that Simon West, this is his debut.
Oh, is it?
Which is crazy.
That's it. How did he get this film first?
I don't know, but if I had to suggest, and this is something that, Marvel movies haven't really said, but I've said, in my opinion, like, I think this is what's occurring, based off conversations and interviews, like a lot of, the whole Edgar Wright Ant-Man thing, Ryan Coogler's, dissatisfaction with how Black Panther was made. You got a studio that is like, look, I know what I want. I want Michael Bay. I can't get Michael Bay. Go do Michael Bay, Simon West. So you get a young director who will basically be bossed around. And Jerry Bruckheimer was big enough at this point that he could he was the studio.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
Marvel in this
Absolutely.
case. So
after Top Gun,
he could just, yeah. So he could just do that. He was like, yeah, I worked with Tony Scott. Like, I loved how that looked. Can we do that, more of that, please? And you get that vibe. He's churning them out, baby.
I don't know if this disrupts everything you're going to do, Abe, but I think it's important to acknowledge that Simon West is also known for directing Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley, the music video.
Oh, yeah, baby.
Like,
it's
the internet's favorite thing.
In fact, he had to choke out Michael Bay in order to get the job. Also important on his, so right after Con Air, he did The General's Daughter.
Yeah, amazing.
Which is, we love The General's Daughter in this house.
Oh, yeah.
Also Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, the 2001 version.
Yeah.
And since then, he's created, some garbage, like The Mechanic and Expendables 2, and he's got a great career, man.
He's worked.
I would love to have this career.
Yeah, he's worked.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a bad life.
It's not a bad life. Simon West.
He's done a bunch of other stuff that you haven't heard of, but those are the ones you have heard of.
Right. So let's move on to the breakout in the film. Like when, Dave Chappelle does his little hijinks and burns a man and, pulls the lever and gets John Malkovich and company out of their cages. Even this is still singles of people. They're just single cut to single cut to single. There's no wides. There's just telephoto angles of faces doing the things that I was just saying. And when there is kind of a wider shot, it's like at their feet. And I don't mean wide shot in terms of field of view. I mean wide angle, actually, right. I should say. Sometimes they choose a wider angle and not a telephoto angle. But in those cases, they put the camera on the ground looking up, so from their feet, so you're not getting depth you're taking the width and the depth away from the wide-angle lens, which is one of the reasons you use a wide-angle lens. Also, they do stuff like obstructing a lot of the wide angles. It's not a weird choice. I mean, it kind of fits, but it's just like, it's clear they're doing everything they can to not stitch together this location.
Yeah.
And that's maybe out of necessity. We're not sure.
Well, can we briefly talk about what would necessitate that?
Right.
Like, so one idea that occurred to me as I was reading your theory is maybe they didn't have everybody all these days.
Yeah,
like maybe there was
one of the reasons, or that would be one of the benefits of this shooting strategy is you wouldn't need them.
Right. So, like, just to be clear for people who are not filmmakers, so like, every production you have to plan what days everyone's available, right? And like, one of the assumptions that's 100% not true is that you get all the actors together and they all shoot together for those 30 days or whatever it is. But the truth is, when you get a cast of this caliber, even back then, I think you're going to deal with somebody, like, hey, I can't be there that week, but you need to be filming that week, which means you got to compose shots to not see them so you don't miss them.
Right.
This shooting style would accommodate that. I kind of wonder if that's part of what's happening here. I also wanted to bring up as a counterpoint, because I think that we've both watched this film recently and it's interesting. This is the same year that Event Horizon was made, right?
Okay.
And Event Horizon went to great pains to show you the set.
And even if you're close in, wide angle that shit.
Right. But the problem with it is then you start picking the set apart. And one of the smart things about this movie is you never really pick the plane apart. Right?
Nope.
You don't think about it really.
Yeah.
So it's kind of effective.
And sometimes that's the allure of these telephoto lenses that feel like when the pace is right and you're moving at a certain speed, you don't really fucking ask questions.
Yeah.
And some of those questions are like, wait, where is everybody?
Yeah, where are people?
And it doesn't piss you off. Whereas in another instance where you're like, that's important and the pace isn't as quick and I'm not spending time thinking about it, you could be totally angry as an audience member about it. And then in another instance, you find it forgivable. You don't even think about it. That's how much power a director really has by making these decisions. Another decision I noticed is that shots are flat. This is kind of an effect of not shooting with the wide-angle lens. Wide-angle lenses are very good at showing depth.
Right.
Because something that we call kind of depth cues are things like diagonal lines, deep backgrounds, perspective shots. So we get the feeling of it goes off to infinity. Wide angles give you more opportunity for layering in the frame. You can have multiple mid positions and foreground and background. Not as true in the case of a telephoto lens. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. And then John Malkovich talks. It kind of the bow breaks and the inmates have control. And John Malkovich takes his center position and is like, I got the plane.
Underlit too, in a funny way.
And that's when we finally get a wide of the whole ship. And this is the only argument for why, they clearly made the whole ship and they had it.
Oh, yeah.
Because you have that. And in fact, there's a great shot of when he kind of chirps up and he's like, everyone pay attention. There's a shot down the tube of the plane that is the deepest shot in the whole thing. It's got multiple layers of depth as inmates kind of perk up like prairie dogs in different, distances on the Z-axis from the camera. So not all shots fall in this kind of flat, deep dichotomy. And I suspect that these closer wides and telephoto singles that we're seeing earlier come from knowing also that it's our central location. And he didn't want to blow his wad in the first 20 minutes and show all the geography. So he waited for the Act 1 break. And so the next 40 minutes aren't boring. And Adam talked about this on another Directorpiece Theater with John Hughes and Breakfast Club. Varying your perspectives around beats of the film give the visual cue to the audience that we're kind of in a new stage. They're definitely doing this in Con Air. At least subconsciously, it will feel different, even if you're like, oh, now we're from this side, or now we're using these angles. You'll notice it because it's just how we perceive the canvas. Now, as you mentioned, this may be done out of necessity, but like most filmmaking that's done well, your limitations kind of guide your decisions and strengthen the project. That's just if you're the smallest filmmaker with the lowest budget, or you're Michael Bay. That is true.
Yeah, well, it has to be true if you want to continue to work.
Right. And a final thought on the wide shots, telephoto shot aspect of this movie is the widest shots in this movie are outside, the tarmacs and the landing sequence, and that's kind of not surprising when like the inmates leave the plane. We start to see a little bit more wides as well, and I think there's some subconscious like widest freedom that may be obvious to some. Also, the love sequences. Which are outside, but like the love sequences where he's like talking to his daughter and his wife, which happens twice. Love is like a long shot. It's always a long shot, and that throws into the face, since it both happens outside. Throws in the face of the idea that just because you're outside, that means it's a wide angle. It's very intentional when he's deploying these lenses and when he's not.
Do you think do you think that the director's thinking analytically about like making that connection, or is it about? Do you think that the director thinks that the more compressed the space, the more intimate I feel with the character?
My opinion is that I think most directors fire from the hip.
Yeah.
And it's an instinctual learning that comes from just watching and developing a grammar of film by just consuming all of the greats, all of the shitty movies that you watch in your life. You kind of develop, I like that, I like that, I like that. If I were to make a film, I'm going to do it this way. I do think that smarter filmmakers and filmmakers who know what they're doing and why they're doing it, which is most filmmakers, honestly, like maybe not TV, where they're like following a prescribed paint by numbers kind of rota. Like this is more like when you have not just an auteur, but like someone who's kind of got a studio that has a light hand, or they're known for their, like someone like Jordan Peele or something like that, to give, a relevant example of like, they give them freedom, right? I think that the people who know what they're doing often will think about it technically. Maybe they'll find it after the fact, but they'll be like, oh yeah, that is what I want. And I want it might as well keep doing it if it makes sense for the film.
Yeah.
And, like sometimes they break their own formats because they know it's not like the end all be all, that people glean this kind of stuff, like how the shots remark on the thematic resonance. I don't think that you get points for that. Maybe in my nerdy book, but I don't think that audience members are like, oh, that's crazy how the telephoto lenses are really being deployed in the act too. Like that shit doesn't really matter.
Right.
But it does. But if you understand what a telephoto lens does to the canvas, does to the image itself, and you're using it effectively to construct a visual strategy that effectively aligns with your theme or your story, then I think that you're doing the narrative justice, and it's a better work for that purpose. So absolutely, I think that the best people think about it technically.
I love that answer. I thought that was really well elocuted.
Thank you.
Well done.
Let's talk about cops and
robbers. That's all I wanted to do. Let's get to it. Get to the cops.
So sometimes we talk about in this movie, you often have with your antagonist, protagonist, or different groups of people, you have two basic spaces, right? Or three basic spaces. But in this movie, it's two basic spaces that exist in this movie. Like most movies about crime or the criminal justice system, there's the criminal side and there's the cop side. I do want to mention that while most of the movie is preoccupied with maintaining speed and momentum, and I'll talk about that, how like the Michael Bay influence and other filmmakers' influence in the speedy kind of pacing of scenes, you will notice a lot of static shots in the Cusack-Cole-Meany scenes. Yeah. And I think that this is very intentional, because on the reverse side, you get crazy amounts of momentum, small dolly moves, drifts to the face, like whip pans and stuff like that. And the Cusack-Cole-Meany stuff is just like absolutely mundane. And I think this is supposed to be kind of their home base, and the inmates are kind of always on the move. That's kind of what they're setting up there. But there isn't much of a difference in what he's doing between these two spaces. Like, you could go even further, and typically films do, where they say, like, this world looks like this world looks like this, and I'm separating these worlds so that you really feel it when I cut. I know, oh, I'm with the cops now. But Wes doesn't do that as much, other than the thing I just mentioned. He actually does the opposite. He, in terms of like color affinity and color differences, the backgrounds are gray and blue in the Cusack Colmini stuff, and that's true of like the whole movie, also on the plane. So you don't really get like a color differentiation of worlds or like a production design differentiation of worlds. A lot of movies do that, but Con Air is trying to make the whole thing feel cohesive, because I think it knows that it moves at a clip, you know, and it's like, I don't have time, just like The Decision 4, I don't have time to show you the geography of every scene. I'm not really going to throw a lot of color stuff at you or lighting changes at you, because I want you to just be on for the ride. I don't want you to have to think about the scene or like where we are.
I think that's right. I think
you just kind of roll with it.
It would be a problem for the movie if I had to emotionally divest myself or get interested in like, well, what are the cops up to? You know, like, how do they feel about stuff? Like,
kind of the job of the director. You don't want that. Like, something that one of my professors mentioned is, he said, like, the difference between theater and film is not the acting, it's not the rehearsal. A lot of people talk about that, and that's true. But what a director and what they really do when it comes to the image and how that influences literally everything when you're making a movie is that you're guiding the eye. When I'm in the audience, I can look at any fucking thing in it while I'm watching it play. Right. I can look at that person's shoe. I can look at that person's face. I can look at like an extra in the corner. You have no power over me. I am the determiner of what I see. That's not true in movies. Movies are like, nope. I mean, it is to a little extent. Like, you can be a little piece of shit and be like, haha, you'll never catch me. I'll look at the backgrounds all the time. But you more or less are guided. And I think speaks to Simon West kind of, and Michael Bay and all these other filmmakers, that they're just like, if I don't give them time to be distracted, I have them. And I think that there's power in that. And so he's matching the drabness of the plane with its grates and its metal plating with these gray and blue backgrounds where, frankly, they shouldn't exist. One scene in particular, Cusack talks to Nick Cage's wife and kid in his office, and like the color affinity is wild. It's blue folders, blue walls, blue overalls on the little girl. Even the wife's eyes, I'm 50% confident that they hired this woman because she has crazy blue eyes just for these scenes. It just reminds me of how far you can go with this stuff before it becomes loud enough to really notice. I think that most viewers would watch this and it would totally pass them by. But if you're looking at the affinity of, like, the color affinity of these shots, you're like, holy shit, this whole thing is blue and it's all production design. And that makes me think of kind of how, like, Directorpiece started with The Wedding Singer. You kind of have to go really far to get noticed because people will take a lot for granted. And that's cool. That's a cool thing about movies. It means that we have more leeway as directors and storytellers to do exactly what we want.
I actually think you notice more when a director isn't doing that.
Yes, because then you're like, what am I supposed to focus on?
Like, you assume the director is gonna reduce the amount of stimuli, like, in a film, especially if the film has any action or sci-fi elements or something. Like, that's just sort of the template. Or like if the movie takes place in Wall Street, for instance, right? Like, every movie in Wall Street is the same color palette, basically.
Yeah.
You know,
it's like, it's beige and
gray, blue. You know what I mean? Like, this is sort of the action movie color template. This is kind of an early film for that, actually.
But the cool hues and the blues are, like, definitely a thing that occurred in the late 90s for sure.
And it just stuck around.
Once we got into the 2000s and after the digital intermediate, which is, if you're not aware of that, it kind of started with like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? If you've seen that Coen Brothers movie, it has like a caked in look that makes it feel old timey. That's a lot of that is like the heavy processing in digital post, where you essentially can put a tint on the whole movie and still make it look really good, where it's not just like a filter that looks crappy on things, like a sepia filter or something like that. and a lot of people mimic that. That's like you could draw like a direct parallel to like how Harry Potter movies started to look dark and creepy and more like David Fincher films. In fact, we talked about that in one Directorpiece theater. That's because it was just in the early 2000s, people couldn't get enough of that shit, you know? And it's also why we get things like The Spirit or Sin City, where you have the complete opposite, where it's just like creating a totally other world. All right.
Sorry for the distraction.
Let's talk about,
I apologize.
let's pivot away from image and talk about time.
Yeah.
Specifically, I want to kind of introduce like what I've been hinting at with Michael Bay and that era, like as he started with like The Rock and, you know, pacing and how pacing was being developed during this time, like 1995 to 19, you know, or to 2000. Like the speed is another one that comes to mind. So when people do a thing over and over, typically, and I'd say this is true about most aspects of life, they typically call it like a tactic or a style, like that's that person's style. But when a whole group of people do it, it now becomes something that we call like a genre or a form, right? One could argue that there's like a style of Wes Anderson, and then there's twee films, right?
That's true.
And I think we probably not get a lot of disagreement on that. I know it's not 1-to-1 for every case, but you know, one person started it and someone else kind of copied it or, you know, developed it even further. Sometimes it's also convergent evolution. It's just we're at the right time where we're going to, like, I think that if you look internationally in the early 2000s, you got a lot of displacement of time films and nonlinear storytelling coming from Mexico, coming from Britain, coming from America. Yeah, they influenced each other, but I think it was just about time that movies were like, let's really fuck with how in which we tell the movie and not just do a literal, like, linear thing. But that's not important. In any case, there comes a time when it's not yet a cliche, something that someone does in a movie, but people are mimicking it because it just feels like the right thing to do. And Exhibit A in this case is what I would say is Michael Bay and his kind of, you know, ability to kind of just like knock people's socks off with some of his shots. And he definitely popularized like the high speed pacing of a lot of his narratives in the late 90s and early 2000s. A lot of scenes jump around from one conversation to another. I hinted at the fact that you get one group of characters and then another, and we don't really shoot what we'd call a basic sequence where you get a wide shot and singles of the subjects, because that would be too much investment for this short scene where it's like 3 lines or whatever. So we started to see films and TV crop up that would cut out the wide or just have fewer lines per scene. And then we cut to another one, and we cut to another one. And ultimately, I feel like this is where you get the intense momentum of these movies. And that's probably starting in the 70s, but like ultimately they refined it to like a specific pacing in the 90s. There's this kind of joke that Michael Bay is always at an 11,
Oh, yes.
right? One of our story professors at school would have a lecture where he kind of quotes the famous Kurt Vonnegut story lecture, which you can find on YouTube, and it's great. And any storyteller or person interested in the forms of storytelling should definitely check that out, where he explains drama of stories with things like bell curves and sine waves, where he says like, all right, so if the x-axis is time, and, you know, the y-axis is drama or excitement of the audience member or whatever you really want to in that vein. What are the forms that we have appropriated for storytelling through the history of time? And it's all about the dynamics of feeling momentum and how traditionally pacing would be proportional to those aspects of the story, like an all is lost moment or, you know, the highest of the highs. Obviously, you'd get a very specific difference between those two. So the professor would make this joke where he would just draw a line at the top of the graph at the very height of the y-axis and say, what story is this? And then he would make the joke, it's a Michael Bay film. And yeah, laugh, good bit. But this high-octane story crafting doesn't really come out of nowhere. I know it's like a joke to make fun of the fact that Michael Bay is always an 11. And I think that's true. I mean, there are definitely arguments of times in where there is a reprieve. But some can argue it's kind of an abuse of the format.
Well, and sometimes it doesn't work because of that. Like some of his movies don't work because
sometimes
of that
people
problem.
are like, Yeah, I'm too overwhelmed is sometimes
and
people will
therefore
say
don't
that.
care. Like some
Exactly.
of those Transformer movies, that's exactly what happens.
I'd say that's usually a failure of
Yeah.
writing, but this goes hand in hand with that. You know, it's like sometimes it's being used as a crutch. That's an example of bad screenwriting. But sometimes it's very effective. Like I would say almost the entirety of The Rock. But there's this legitimate story trick that movies and TVs have done for hundreds of years or 100 years they coined it meanwhile back in the ranch. And I feel like we've talked about this a little bit. I definitely have talked to Adam about
That's
it.
all we talk about when we hang out.
The idea here is that you have like group A and you have like group B of characters with scenes from an A plot and a B plot. So you can cut to any scene and out of any scene just so, and this is what you want, it's only the relevant or exciting aspect of what's going on. So it's a good trick to have something to cut to so that in that one moment where that person says that one thing that really like, oh shit, it just got taken to the next level, you can cut away. And they call that, meanwhile, back at the ranch. This happened. Meanwhile, back where we started, this happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And audiences have gotten used to this over the years. And these movies are just that, but firing at a higher gear, right? That's all that we're doing here. But the kind of assessment of what is being done and kind of the motivation for why they're doing it is the same. It's no different from Westerns from the 50s,
right.
You know?
Of course.
Another clear nod to Michael Bay, I noticed, is that when we kind of arrive at the tarmac, like after they land to get refuel, the inmates kind of have this moment where they realize, oh, the cops are coming, so we got to we have urgency suddenly. We're not in control of the situation. The cops are almost there because John Cusack's doing his thing. And that's when we get this counter movement sweeping dolly move, which you will all immediately recognize as like the Bad Boys shot, highway shot, right? It's in every Michael Bay movie ever. Someone turns to one side of the camera, the dolly moves from that spot all the way in, and it's at a slight angle, so we have this counter movement from, let's say it's going right to left, but his face is going left to right. So we arrive at the perfect composition, and it's very fast. In fact, it's a very particular speed. Michael Bay always has the same speed. This shit happens literally in Con Air twice in a row. The first time at the airfield, there's a moment of when the cops arrive, and bam, those shots just come out of the woodwork. And
that's out of the woodwork is a great description of where they come from.
You need a lot of camera track for these shots. They're big setups typically. They
take a long time.
Shot. Yeah, and the reason you need more than you probably think is because they're not almost always they're not on a very wide lens. They're usually on a wide to medium. Like probably like a 40 to like 60 or something like that. And it means there's more space between the subject and the camera and the subject and the background. In other words, I think the plane set doesn't really have space for it.
Okay.
But the second they did have space outside, oh boy, they went for it.
That's funny.
And I think that is a clear indication of them trying to ape the Michael Bay style. It's at least I'm probably, Jerry Bruckheimer's probably, spinning right now because like he kind of was a part of this whole
But
thing.
Michael Bay is there's a great Every Frame of Painting about this. But like Michael Bay is very good at using many different elements to create counter motion. Like not even just the actor, right? Like he'll use a dolly, then the actor, then a thing like a prop or like a plane in the background or whatever to like sort of finish the motion in a new direction. Like he's so good at that. And you can
he's layering it.
It's natural for him.
He's very aware of the speed.
Yeah, he gets it. Like and it seems to me like watching his work that he kind of he doesn't seem to take all day to get it either. So he really does kind of know how to choreograph like that.
I think he knows how specific he wants it, and he knows how to build those shots, so he knows when to start them to not impact the schedule. He gets more people.
Directors imitating Michael Bay never have quite the confidence or the flourish of his shots. Like
They don't.
they there's the feeling of like, oh yeah, I know what this is. Like there's a familiarity to it, so it's sort of a comforting thing, but it never gives you the wow that Michael Bay does. He's great at that.
Yeah, I think that's from the Every Frame of
Yeah.
Painting kind of. You don't see a lot of directors able to actually perfectly mimic it, and I would say that extends to Simon West. He does a really good job.
Yeah.
But it kind of feels out of place a little bit just because it's less the execution of the actual shot, which is pretty good, and more the fact that it like feels out of place in the film a little bit.
Right.
Like you haven't been seeing these crazy sweeping shots yet. And so it kind of comes out of nowhere. Maybe that I'm wrong about that, and people are like, no, it's fine.
I don't think it bothers you.
But I think that there's something to be said. Yeah, it doesn't bother you, but it's just like not what you're expecting necessarily based off the setup of the movie so far and what you've been watching.
It's
that's
been
fine.
tight
That's
and
fine.
controlled for the most part up to that point. As like, you know, like it's not adventurous. Michael Bay movies always feel like the camera's just about to fall off the dolly or whatever. That's what's so cool about his movies is it's like, man, he really pushed that all the way. You know?
Right. Yeah. I think that Edgar Wright does some good stuff.
He's more strategic.
He may not do he doesn't do the Michael Bay shot all the
Right.
time. He has faked it in things like Hot Fuzz, but he also does the momentum kind of control with whip pans.
Yes.
That's his bread and butter,
Yes.
really. He loves
And
whip
edits.
pans that like land on a and fast editing, which is not unique to him. That's a very British sentiment to do the kind of jumpy cut thing that's been around forever. But yeah, there's just people mimicking people. That's all. This is all it ever is. And I think that's probably the main reason that these movies all kind of look the same. We mentioned the bluish, colder color palettes, the telephoto coverage, the amped up piecing and editing. There's less of a focus on geography, unless it's like a set piece. And I think that they're all learning from each other and mimicking each other's work. So that's interesting. But also because this isn't Michael Bay, it may be a little rough around the edges if you're comparing it to like how Michael Bay this is. This is still a decent Michael Bay film. Simon West, who isn't the names we mentioned before dominating the action genre in this era, still could piece this together effectively. And I think Jerry Bruckheimer knew what's up as well, and he knew that, like, look, I've worked on these movies with these directors. This is what they needed. That's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you the same stuff. And that's a smart producer right there. There's a lot of questions about the, validity of this movie. Is it a classic? Is it a bad movie? I don't know.
It's very silly.
It's
extremely silly.
I'm not going to wade in that shit.
Yeah.
But it's a type of movie that at one time was a very effective one. It's it's very anthemic of its time. And I still think there's a lot of nostalgia for that time to this day. And I think modern blockbusters and action movies still do these tricks. You mentioned like Christopher Nolan. I think critical darlings like him and Denis Villeneuve, they do pacing tricks that are not that different from what Michael Bay was doing in 1996 or 1997. And I think those recent films kind of came out of that tradition. It's not like they're faking or ripping off Michael Bay. It's just that tradition became kind of the zeitgeist. It took hold of this is how you make an action movie in the minds of a lot of directors, and therefore in the minds of a lot of the audience members who watch these films, for sure. And that's it. Those are my last thoughts on Con Air as being an example of a Michael Bay, non-Michael Bay
knock
movie.
off Michael Bay.
And
they don't
the
make
reasons
this
for that
anymore.
They don't make a lot of movies anymore.
Right, obviously. But it's funny because you start like when you think about what is an action movie, you don't think of Marvel movies because that feels like they're their own genre, right? And they are. But like
they're like action adventure.
Right. Every
really.
couple years a Die Hard ripoff comes out, and I guess this technically is a Die Hard, but like this for a long time felt very much like, would be on a Mount Rushmore of like, you get it, summer action movies. Right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
there'd be some version of a Roland Emmerich film, some version of a Michael Bay film like Con Air, which isn't a Michael Bay film. you know, and then
It's
like
one of
a Die Hard,
those. Yeah.
you know, like that would be what it, and like Predator, something like Predator would be in there, you know.
Yeah.
Like that's action films, and I'm not sure if any of those films are really getting made consistently anymore. I mean, I
Well, I
guess
mean, yeah,
Moonfall
I
is,
think
right?
the palette is different. You get tired of the same thing. I think that
Right.
there's a lot to be said about when nothing gold can stay, right?
I guess that's right. All
Like
things
there,
must pass.
all things must pass. People are gonna get tired of it because they're gonna see it for the sixth, seventh iteration, and they're gonna be like, "Yeah, I got it when they did it this time." Or even if they're not aware that like what movie they saw that kind of thing in, they're kind of expecting it. You know, there's so many tropes in TV that are just so overly abused. The one I always mention is the in someone disappears in Act 2 of like a TV show, and then in Act 3 comes back right at the time when your protagonist is about to be killed off by the villain, and they
Right.
got a gun at him, and they're on the ground, kind of thing, and then they get shot from behind the back by the character that hasn't been in the thing for a while.
Which is your
How many
favorite
times
bit?
is
You love it.
it's my favorite bit because
Yeah.
what I love about that bit and how like the syntax of movies are like how that dialogue between the audience member and the filmmakers is happening regardless of if either side wants that conversation to be having. And it's funny to me that that trope in particular has lasted so long. Like it's present in the 70s, you know, in
Right.
Bullet and shit. And it's also like abused in Game of Thrones, you know, like it's wild how often it's used, and it's always been a crutch because it's like, oh, yeah,
It's
so
a
someone
yada yada.
saved the day.
Yeah, it's a yada yada.
So it was all a fake out anyway. Like no one was really in danger because of the plot armor thing. But it's that type of stuff that we feel slighted when they do it too much. This is at a time when we didn't feel slighted by these maneuvers yet. Now I think we do.
Now
I
we
think
do,
that
yeah.
Transformers and like the CG fest of it all really sullied us on these types of movies because we were just like, oh man, if I'm getting this cool thing, I'm also getting this trash thing, and I don't want the trash thing. And so those aren't expertly tied. You know, it's a very interesting soup that's going on here.
It's true. I mean, yeah, there's lots of genres that die out that you don't think of as being genres if they weren't something you cared about.
Mhm.
And this like summer blockbuster Michael Bay movie is one of those where like
Yeah.
I bet you somebody who's like 20, you know, has absolutely couldn't care less about Con Air. Right? Like even if they watched it now, they'd be like, "Yeah, I don't care." Sort of like anybody that's like 5 to 10 years younger than me has no interest whatsoever in like a knockoff French Connection.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
even French Connections like you know, like
It's
Death
fine.
Wish or The Enforcer.
Right.
Like
Right.
that whole genre is dead. We just don't make it anymore. You know?
Yeah, we'll have a throwback in a movie, but it's not like going to start a new trend until it does, like the neo-western, you know, like sometimes it really does come back. Uh but not necessarily always.
Not usually. Not usually.
And the other thing about this kind of trend of filmmaking and all like kind of the details I described about like how they're approaching these movies, it it is like we mentioned kind of a genre specific thing, but it's also pervasive to other genres. I want to look at like in 1997, I'm just looking at the list of like bigger movies.
Mm-hmm.
Fucking Volcano came out, and
Volcano, baby.
feels like a Roland Emmerich. I
It's
mean, it's
Roland
definitely a
Emmerich.
Roland Emmerich,
Yeah.
but it's also a Michael Bay, right?
Right.
It's
between
also
the
got
two.
a lot of these shots, a lot
Right.
of these techniques, which you know Roland Emmerich is also aping. So maybe it's just out of the aspect of the Roland Emmerichness of it all, but it's definitely something that there was some kind of two-way street happening between, you know, the disaster film and the action film, obviously.
That's a fun connection to make. Yeah, I mean Roland Emmerich probably isn't as distinct a figure as I think he is, because people who were cinephiles probably have a sense of the disaster film directors that I don't connect to. That are like, well, he just stole it all from this guy, you know. Anyway,
Yeah.
wonderful theory.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed myself listening to it. Also, I just kind of miss these movies a bit. So it's fun that
They're
to
a
go
lot
back and
of
revisit them.
they're fun in a strange way.
It's so silly. Yeah, they're so
it's
silly.
so silly.
Right. They didn't feel silly at the time, too. That's the thing is like, the experience you had watching was like, yeah. And like, boy, you don't have that anymore. That's gone.
We're also children, more or less. So,
I don't know. Like,
we could be distracted pretty easy.
I don't know if that's true because, like, my dad watches a dad movie from that time and has the same experience of it. It seems like,
Right.
I
That might
maybe
be true then.
maybe it's the movie watcher thing where if you watch as many things as you and I do,
Right.
the exhaustion
Nothing
sets
works
in. I don't know.
and you're empty inside.
Right, exactly. Joy is gone
And
from our hearts.
you just watch movies alone.
It just happens to you.
Yeah.
The movie just happens to you.
The sound is on, but you're not hearing. Your eyes glaze over.
The film is lit, but you're not perceiving it.
Yeah. Is the monitor reflecting my eyes, or is my eyes reflecting the monitor? Questions like this come up.
Has there ever been eye light for me? Have I ever had eye light?
And then you make a podcast. This is where we are. This is 2024. I've been Abe Epperson.
I've been Adam Ganzer. For real, what a wonderful time. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, man.
I like it a lot.
Thank you. I love doing these with you. I love talking shop. They're exhausting, These are exhausting days.
They're long days. These. Yeah. Well, I mean, nobody needs to hear us complain about it, but like, Directorpiece is, and this is similar to being a director.
Job in the world.
It's a great job, and it requires intense analysis and concentration while you're doing it. Right? Like that's a thing that I think when you haven't directed something, you think of directing in this kind of you think of it as a much more passive experience than it really is. Like the intense concentration that it takes to get a shot list and storyboards done, and then the intense concentration that it takes to get through a setup and a shot and get the thing and it works now. Like the level of tension of all that. You get we just get a micro dose of it creating Directorpiece, and that's fun for us. But then you're tired. Right?
Well, and more for me, there's so much shit that I'm like, oh, that could be a Directorpiece, and then I watch it and I'm like, that's garbage. I'm insulting everyone's time. This at least, people can go watch Con Air at home and listen to this episode and be like, that's true about Con Air.
That was a thing. You're right.
That was a thing. I don't know if I care about that, but that's true.
And
now I watch Con Air. That's you. That's you.
That's you. You sound like that. I watched Con Air a year and a half ago trying to find a Directorpiece and did not retrieve one. So that's the joy of Abe and his unique brain is he found this thing to talk about.
It's true. We both have brains that are different.
That's right. We're not the same person. Please stop telling us that we are.
Love it. That's true. You got to stop doing that, people.
Please stop.
Now what are we doing? Now they're just going to do it
more.
We'll
never end. This podcast will never be over.
Call us both Abe or Adam. Who gives a shit?
Yeah, nobody cares.
We're
My
the
parents
director
call
guys.
me Abe now. Yeah.